Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and my guest today is also my co-host, Janelle Blue. We're going to talk about an interesting topic. When Janelle presented the title, I thought Castro had a land in Texas, but wrong Castro. But we're going to talk about, and some of you may be familiar with the German influence in Texas, particularly the Texas Hill Country, and that still continues today. There's that strong German population. But you may not know that the French also competed for the free land that they were competing for. So, Janelle, tell us about Castro's colony and about your ancestors in the colony.
I'm happy to, and thanks for having me today. I have to say, when my husband reviewed my materials, he had the same thing. He's like, now is this Fidel
Castro, because that was my first thought.
And no, Henri Castro was French, but he might have also been Portuguese too, so a long time earlier than Fidel. So my ancestor was Pierre Prunier. And he was from the region of Ducèvre in France, and that's on the west coast of France, kind of south of Normandy, if you're familiar. Pierre was 46 and his wife was 42, Félicité, when they decided to immigrate from Ducèvre to Texas. And they had 4 children, including my 2 times great-grandfather. And he was the oldest at 12. So just think, now these people are leaving a lovely place in France, and they're going to come to the Wild West, or what they didn't call it that then. They said it was like the Garden of Eden, to this unknown place in Texas with these little bitty children. And this was 1842. So this was pretty early. This was before all the ships got better accommodations. And most of the French who immigrated to America, when you think about the French, you think about the Alsace-Lorraine, which is on the sort of the east side of France. But we'll do this slide in a minute. But they came from the western side. So I don't know. Later on, there were Alsatians who joined, but for now, there's nothing in the records that I can find that show them anywhere in that part of France. So they were over in Ducèvre. They were on the first ship. So Castro had this colony of people and I'll tell you about it in a minute. But my relatives were on the very first ship that departed from Le Havre, and they arrived in Galveston on New Year's Day in 1843. And so there were 144 colonists on that ship. There are records, extant records, that we're able to benefit from.
Now this would include all the children.
Well, that's right. There were only 42 persons who were eligible to receive the land grant. So those would have been the heads of household. And the rest, you can imagine how many children are relatives that were there, who maybe not everybody was a head of household, even though they might have been adults. They came along as helpers or something. I think we need to back up a little bit and talk about Texas for a minute, because we're talking about 1843. That's right in the middle of when Texas became was a republic. So they won the independence from Mexico in 1836, and they remained independent for 10 years before becoming the 28th state in December 28, 1845. I'm not quite ready for that yet. And because of the revolution, they were deep in debt. They had no money. The United States was in a financial crisis at the time, so they didn't really want to take on this extra debt because they had their own problems. The Republic was acknowledged by France and Britain as as a real country. But they went to Europe to try to get some money. They wanted people to lend them money, and it was difficult to do. But one of the enticements was, maybe if we can get some European immigrants in here and we can go to France, that maybe, because they had their own problems and they were interested in having some citizens in Texas that they wanted to get rid of some of the immigration too. So Texas wanted farmers, though, which is kind of funny because it turns out the land that Castro had was not really good farming land. But that was one of the things that they really wanted. Texas at the time, Texas had 151 million acres of land with about a 500,000 population. So it was, there was a lot there. But a lot of that land had already been promised in other grants. So Castro had to really work to be able to get some dedicated land that they could then offer to immigrants. The borders of Texas were mostly uninhabited, and so they really wanted the population to live down in those borders, which was risky. I mean, there were Mexicans, there were Indians. The Mexicans were not happy, and so that was a bit of a problem.
So to try and keep them out of taking the land back.
Yeah, they would just, And so the name of the group of the immigrants brought to Texas was called Castro's Colony. Okay. And he actually wound up bringing in 6,100 colonists to Texas, which was one of two of the most plentiful of these programs. So who was Henri Castro? He was a citizen of France. He had a background in finance, and he was a smooth talker. Because he had a background in finance, he had access to financial markets, and he had served in political positions in France, and he had also lived in the United States for a while. So he had an excellent English, which was important. And so he was very interested in setting up this land deal because, of course, here was part of the deal. For every 640 acres that you got, he got back half of it.
Oh, okay.
So that was a pretty sweet deal.
Yes.
Now, did that actually come to pass? I don't think it did, but that was the agreement in the beginning, and that was in the fine print of these contracts that they put together. So and they wanted wealthy people. They wanted farmers or people who had some agricultural knowledge, and we'll see what happens. Obviously, that didn't exactly happen. He set up this fancy place in Paris to recruit these people, and eventually figured out he better go into the hinterlands to find them. But he was successful.
You don't think of farmers living in Paris even back then.
Well, not farmers, but maybe like large plantation owner kind of people,
okay.
Large landowners. And so that was the deal, recruit the wealthy, because we want to bring money into the state, and we want to have people who are ready to set up production and can get going, because Texas needed people and they needed the revenues that they could bring. So here were some of the contracts. There was only one thing they needed to do. They needed to sign the contract and immigrate, and then they could have the land, or they would have the grant. The grant didn't necessarily equate to land. It was just an entitlement or an opportunity. And again, it was the 640 acres. That's typical for most grants. Right. And so the colonist had to put up a deposit of 100 francs or $20. That was sort of translated a few years ago, which could be redeemed upon arrival in the concession land. So that was sort of a security deposit to make sure they actually got there. And then each immigrant was given detailed written instructions, customs information, train schedules to the port of embarkation, where to stay, cost of lodging. You know, we just did a show on immigrants coming into New York and how the ones that weren't very well prepared, you know, they got taken advantage of. And it looks like Castro did a good job of preparing these immigrants on what they needed to worry about. They were supposed to bring up food, cooking utensils, and also whom to contact and where to contact them upon arrival. Now that didn't exactly all go as planned, but it did later on. And also he asked them to keep journals, and I'm not sure how many of those exist, but that was a clever thing. He wanted to use them for advertisement purposes.
Right. But that's good information if you can find those today.
I know.
To know what the conditions were like and what the problems were and what the good things were.
And I have to say that a lot of the information that I'm talking about came from a book. It was actually a PhD thesis that Bobby D. Weaver did on Castro's colony. And so he cites many sources of letters and correspondence back and forth between the Republic and between Castro and between France and different dignitaries. And so I don't know that he cited very much information in these journals. They were also supposed to bring munitions, clothing, and provisions to last 6 months. Now that's really good information and good advice, because we all know that, you know, things aren't the way they're supposed to be when you land. And it turned out that they did a survey of 96 households. There's 79 records that exist about these households. 11 of them, now this is out of 3 different ships that went. 11 of them had no property. 17 had 100, the equivalent of 100 francs or less. And only 17 had property of more than 500. So, you know, only half of them were farmers. So it wasn't exactly as it expected. But then the truth, on the other hand, is what they were being promised was not exactly as advertised either.
Usually isn't.
So my ancestor was not a wealthy farmer. In fact, he was a wool spinner. And I'm not entirely sure what a wool spinner is, but my guess is that, you know, he was making thread. Somehow they were producing.
With the spinning wheel, you know, spinning the wool into thread would be my guess.
And you know what? That could be useful. Maybe not right away, but that would be a useful trade at some point, especially if he was living in a city. But there were no cities like that at the time. And according to the ship manifest, he brought in 1,000 francs. So he wasn't poor and he wasn't rich either, but he was, I guess, an ideal candidate for this. So what did they find when they landed on, now think about New Year's Day in Galveston, Texas. It's bone-chilling cold. It's not freezing necessarily, could be, but it's not like, you know, Massachusetts or anything. But that cold can, you know, it's right there on the bay, and it could be very uncomfortable. But they should have been used to that kind of weather in France. So hopefully they brought, you know, proper clothes. The disappointment was that they weren't allowed to disembark for, 9 days. So now think about
And
that.
why-
They were sitting on the ship for 9 days.
Why
in the,
was that? Do you know?
It doesn't say.
Doesn't say.
And so it could be. My guess is that it was. There were no provisions for them, even though he supposedly had all of this arranged. But maybe the ox cart wasn't ready for them to take them on to the next spot, or maybe the weather conditions were such that they couldn't take the barge that they were going to have to take for 5 miles. Maybe there was illness. Maybe the port, who knows what it was, but 9 extra days of sitting there in the port. Now, when they finally were able to leave, they were going to leave, they left on the 15th. So now we're talking about 15 days. So they must have been able to then go into the city. And I'm sure there was very little.
Probably not much of a city.
Not much of a little town, but maybe there was a boarding house or someplace. Probably not enough to accommodate that many people. So who knows, what they did there. But they were supposed to leave on the 15th by coastal vessel, which was 15 miles. And then proceed overland by ox cart to San Antonio. Now we can put up this this.
Yeah.
So if you look on the left, you can see where it says Corpus Christi, and that's a little south of where Galveston would be on this sort of this hand-drawn map. And what they're trying to do is get clear across to, if you see where Laredo is and then go down a bit, that's kind of where this property was. By the way, there's a big section called the Wild Mustang Desert. They would have had to probably maneuver through that. And then the properties, those little rectangles are the land grant areas. They were right on the Mexican border, and Indians up above. Most of that other area above was Indian territory. I have a better map. This is like a current map, and you can see on that map where Houston, Galveston is, and then just go down to like Nuevo Laredo or that area. It's right in. It's going to be somewhere in there. So take the cursor, go west, sort of southwest. That's tough territory. And so it was 150 miles to San Antonio, which was not their ultimate destination, but it was the largest city, the next population where they could at least go. And there was swampy coastal terrain, and they would only make like 3 or 4 miles a day. So you can imagine, and many, because it's that climate, they got fevers, and people were sick. Now they got to San Antonio, and they could really just go no further, because a lot of treaties had not been settled yet. And eventually, Castro actually bought some land near the San Antonio area. He was advised to buy that land and let the settlers have 5 acres that they could, at least put some kind of accommodation on, and maybe a garden or something until they could get to their land. Now, I have to tell you that Weaver, the author of this book, says that about 5 or 6 of the families refused to go. And my hypothesis is that mine was one of those 5 or 6, because I've only found them in the Houston area. And I can't tell you exactly where they lived for a few years, but when they sold the first piece of property, it was right there in Houston. So my guess is he had enough money where he could just go ahead and say, we're just going to stay right here where there are other people. And I mean, Houston was it was primitive in 1842, but it was better than getting out into the hinterland. And so my guess is they stayed there. Now, the question is, what about his land grant? Well, I have a copy of the land grant that was issued, and that tells me that it was actually, it's hard to read, but it basically states that he was with Castro's colony, which is really important, and that means he was there during the Republic. But you'll notice that the date on this is later, and that's because he eventually made the claim after the fact, probably never went there, but said, wait a minute, I'm still entitled, I came, I did what I was supposed to do, I want my entitlement, and then I'll sell it.
Right.
Which is what they were doing. And eventually they had it surveyed, and that's a copy of the survey, which again refers back to Castro's colony. So I've got good evidence that he was connected with that.
And they're looking for what they can get out of it financially. I mean, my third great grandmother got bounty land from my third great grandfather's service in the War of 1812. Well, you know, it was up in Minnesota or Michigan. I can never remember, one of the two. You know, she didn't want to leave New Jersey and go up there. So first thing she did, she claimed it, but then she sold it off, got the money for it, because that's all she was really interested in. He may have been the same way if he's already established himself in Houston area. Why go out there?
Well, supposedly these things became almost like a commodity. And so there was a whole industry that was in trading these certificates, and they weren't even necessarily, it wasn't until the survey comes that there's a specific piece of land associated with it.
Right.
But that opportunity is there, the entitlement is there. And so my guess is that's what he was doing, was just trying to monetize that. And by the way, my other ancestor who came in a different way, he was a German who came on his own actually and got a land grant. I think the same thing happened there. They never lived up where he did. But anyway, if you've ever been to Texas and you see a town called Castroville, which is up in the hill country, well, that's where these settlers were directed to on the interim basis, and my guess is many of them are probably, those families stayed there rather than go out to the borderland, which was, you know, many, many years before that was safe.
Yeah. Especially, you can think about it, they had this description of what it was going to be like, and then they get there and reality sets in and they say, no, it's not quite like that.
But the problem is, I mean, I just described how hard it was to get even part of the way. Right. It wasn't like they were going to turn back necessarily.
No,
but they might have turned back at least to Castroville or to San Antonio, where it was safe again. But they weren't going to come all the way back to Houston. And that's why I think Pierre and Felicite and their children stayed right there in Houston. Now, my Pierre, Xavier was the son who came with him, and Xavier had a daughter who was my great-grandmother, Mary, and she was born in Texas, and she, despite being French, and I still don't think she's Alsace-Lorraine, but she married into the Germans. In fact, that whole family married into Germans. So there's an argument, if you're trying to prove out, you know, did they really have some connection with Germany? Maybe they did, but I always laughed because that household must have been very interesting. That actually my great-grandfather that she married, you know, he was born in Germany, in Posen, and so he probably spoke good English at that point because he was very young when he came in, but the German and the French in the same household, that would have been an interesting thing. But anyway, they intermarried. They all lived in the German, near the German enclaves in Houston, and there was lots of intermarriage there. And I don't have any pictures of the early settlers. I have a picture of Mary Molly was her name. She had become a real Texan at that point. But what's even more interesting is that most of them are still in Houston after all these years. I'm one of the outliers. I moved away.
You're one of the ones that run away.
Yeah.
Like I am with my family.
I would say that if you have an ancestor who might have come to Texas for land grants, whether it was with Castro Colony or whether it was one of the German colonies, the Texas Land Office down in Austin has copies. They have an index and they have copies of the grants. Whatever exists, they have copies of it there for you to be able to look through. And many times they'll have the survey as well. Sometimes they'll have a conveyance. I do have the deed that shows where my ancestor sold the property to someone else. And that was shortly after it became the certificate. So go there. You can go online and research that by surname to see if it shows up there. But be careful, because those surnames, you need to don't be too perfect about how it was spelled, because it could be something different. But that is available.
This has been very interesting. I've learned a little more about Texas.
I wrote an article recently and said that I'm kind of lonely at the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society because nobody else is interested in Texas. I'm the only native Texan, but let me tell you, a lot of people traveled through Texas. A lot of your ancestors might have lived there for a generation or so before they moved on, so it's worth looking into.
Well, thank you for joining me, Janelle.
It was my pleasure. I always love talking about my ancestors, so thank you for the opportunity.
I think we all do that.
And if you get a chance to visit the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, we'll put our website up, and mvgenealogy.org. Visit us. Visit our website. You're welcome to join us. We look forward to seeing you.